Welcome back. And this session's on the future of work after COVID-19. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Susan Lund, who's a partner at McKinsey and a leader of the McKinsey Global Institute, where her work focuses on the intersection of technology, labour markets and globalisation. Susan's going to present her team's very latest research from McKinsey's report on the future of work after COVID-19. I'm sure you're going to have questions. This is a very thought-provoking report, so do please put them in the Q&A box. It's a short session, but we'll try to get to some of them at the end. Susan, it's wonderful to be here with you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. So in our research, we looked at 8 countries around the world, and we were trying to assess, when the pandemic is over, how many of the changes that we're now experiencing will endure. And so we're taking a long-term view over the next 10 years. And some of what we found is actually quite concerning. The first thing we did was we looked at what physical proximity in a job. This is not something we ever thought about before. We thought about how technology would transform work or how the gig economy is changing the nature of work. But what mattered over the last year is really how physically close a worker is to other people. So we measured physical closeness, the frequency of interactions with other people, whether you're exposed to many different people, think about a ticket taker at an entertainment venue, or the same small team, whether your work is indoors or outdoors, and whether it's site dependent. After doing that for 800 occupations, we then clustered those occupations into 10 different work arenas, as we call them. And we found that COVID's impact in the long term is really going to be concentrated in just several work arenas. So first is on-site customer service. This would be salespeople in retail, hospitality in hotels, so people who face others frequently. The second set of workers who are going to be impacted are those in leisure and travel. So of course, right now we can't really travel or go to crowded entertainment spaces, but this would include workers in restaurants, in airports, in hotels, and we foresee some permanent changes there. The fourth arena is indoor production and warehousing. So that includes factory work, warehouses, as well as things like commercial kitchens. And then finally, office-based work with computers. And there's where remote work and virtual types of work like we're doing now may persist. So why will there be changes? So we look at 3 different sets of trends and assess the extent to which they're going to continue to reshape work after COVID. We don't assume that any of these will be at the same peak that they're at now during the pandemic. But the first set of trends has to do with remote work and virtual meetings. So work from home will continue to some degree, and I'll show you some of the analysis we did there. It's not going to be everybody working from home all the time as we're doing now, but we find that, up to a quarter of the workforce could be working from home 3 to 5 days a week. Business travel. My colleagues in travel and logistics think that business travel will be 20% lower permanently because of the use of virtual meetings. We will go to conferences and hopefully we'll get all together as we did at FT events in the past, but some amount of business travel will disappear. The same is not true of leisure travel. The next big set of trends have to do with e-commerce, online delivery, telemedicine, online education, so use of digital platforms. These platforms attracted a lot of new first-time users over the last year because consumers had no choice. People who weren't used to doing banking on their phone got used to it when bank branches closed. And when we poll those consumers, we find that 50 to 75% of them say they're going to continue using these new digital channels even after they have the opportunity to go back in person. And that's simply because of the convenience and efficiency. So some of the things we've learned to do to adapt over the last year, we found to actually be useful. And so those things will continue. And then finally, there's been an uptick in companies' use of automation and AI. And in many cases, this is because they had no choice to deal with the surge, for instance, for banks in loan applications from small businesses, or for airlines for travel refunds for trips that were not taken. So these are the things that are changing work in the long term. For remote work, I thought it's worth showing because there's sometimes executives will say, well, we think it's less productive. But what we've actually found over the last year is that remote work has actually worked surprisingly well. And a lot of companies that would not have tried it were forced to do so. And now that they've done it, most workers, not all, but we find roughly 3/4 of office workers say that they would like to continue working from home 1 or 2 days a week when the pandemic is over. There is a subset that say they want to go to the office every day for various reasons. And there are some who say they don't mind working remotely permanently. But the vast majority of people say that they'd like, if they have the opportunity, to do both. And this is going to have profound impacts on lunches out downtown, on urban transportation, and on retail stores and where you do your shopping. So what does all of this mean? As we look forward over the next decade, what we see is that there are a set of growing occupations, and those are mainly in healthcare and STEM. And then there are some occupations that are going to decline. And this is notably in customer service and sales. This is the death of retail stores and the shift to e-commerce. It's not to say we won't go shopping or there won't be store clerks, but there could be fewer than there are today. So it's a declining occupation. The same is true in food service, in many basic types of office work as companies use automation, and then the continuing use of robotics in warehouses and factories. And for workers, what this means is that we've got 100 million people in the 8 countries that we study that are going to need to switch occupations. So these are the people who are currently in one of those occupations we project will decline over the next decade. And you can see the results across countries. It's a big increase from what we thought just a year ago before COVID. In the US, it's 28% more people may need to switch occupations than we thought before, and it's between 10 to 20% in the other countries. So for skills, and I know this is about the future of the workforce, what we see is a strong future demand for technological skills. So it's people who can create and maintain and deploy all those new technologies. And it's not just people working at high-tech firms. This is people working in manufacturing and hospitals and retail chains to deploy technology. And then, of course, people who can do what machines don't do well, and that's using socio-emotional skills. So caregivers, teachers, coaches, mentors. And then other types of skills like basic cognitive skills, where jobs that require today mainly just basic literacy, numeracy, or data entry are declining very strongly. The challenge is going to be to get people into upwardly mobile jobs. For the first time, we're seeing many frontline service workers, often low-wage jobs, that may not be there as the first rung in a career ladder. So the challenge for all of us, for companies and for societies, is going to be to take someone, this shows you the example of a cashier, and put them on an upward trajectory, get them on the first rung of a healthcare career ladder or a sales and management career ladder. So for companies, this is really a time to reimagine work, where we work, how technology is used, how we can retain some of the agile and speedy ways of working, what skills the workforce needs, and then finally, what culture is needed. And this issue of lifelong learning and adaptability is going to be just critically important, because the one thing we know is that change and continued disruption is the only thing we can be certain of. There's a role for policymakers as well. And first and foremost, it's to close a digital divide. This recovery will be digital, and people who don't have access to high-speed internet at an affordable price are really missing out on learning, on earning, on transacting. And beyond that, policymakers need to think about how they can support mid-career workers who want to go back and train to do a different occupation and get into one of the growing fields where there's continued demand. We have a range of suggestions for how to do that. But I'd love to pause there and take questions from you, Isabel, and from the audience as well.
Susan, thank you so much. There's so much to think about there. I was really interested in the fact you've taken physical proximity here as a starting point. Is this the first piece of research that, as far as you know, has done that? I haven't seen that before.
I have not seen it either. And it's something, as we thought about what has the pandemic really changed, it was the fact that not all jobs were impacted. If you're in construction, if you are in transportation of goods, your job is going on pretty much as it was before. You're outdoors. There have been many fewer restrictions. But what's really mattered are the jobs where people are working with a lot of different people in close proximity indoors. And because of the pandemic, because of this, companies are taking actions to reduce that density. So, for instance, introducing self-checkout in grocery stores, or introducing ordering on an app in a restaurant instead of speaking to a person. And consumers have found that this is actually pretty convenient. And so that's why many of these things may continue to be used even after the pandemic.
Fascinating. And I guess one of the things that happened last year is that we all stopped worrying about robots taking our jobs and just started worrying, full stop. But what you've shown here is that automation is accelerating. They are coming for our jobs. And how long do you think employers have to think about upskilling or reskilling workforces? What's the time frame?
Well, it's always been a challenge, but it's been accelerated. And there are many companies. The silver lining here is that many companies over the last year did massive reskilling programs with their employees. And people were much more adaptable than we would have thought. So think about educators. There had been plans for online education, but it would have to be rolled in slowly, and teachers would have to be retrained. And, it was implemented in a matter of a week or two. Banks took tellers and made them into customer service remote sales agents. All sorts of different industries had to very quickly redeploy people and train them to do something differently out of necessity. And what we found is that companies can be agile. Individual workers could learn something new very quickly. We didn't need this to be a long transition. We could actually make it happen relatively quickly. So, what I would hope for the future is that even as we go back to the next normal, we can retain some of that speed and agility in how we redeploy people.
Great. Susan, I've taken up a lot of your time with my questions. We've got loads from the audience. Could working patterns change to a 4-day week?
It could. I think it's different in every country that we look at. But one of the things, as I mentioned, is that most people, while they do like to go to the office, you do want to see your colleagues and your friends. And there are many things that are done better in the office, like bringing in new people to the company or brainstorming and innovation, that people also have valued not having the commute time and being able to work from home, spend more time with family and friends, maybe balance more of the things they like to do in the middle of the day. And so I think a lot of barriers have been broken. Many companies' leadership would have been resistant to this idea before the pandemic, assuming that productivity would go down. But this COVID disruption has shown us that that's not the case. If anything, people are working longer hours, maybe making up for some of that commute time.
Yeah, I think it's about 50 minutes a day, isn't it? So there was a big survey last year. We're all working an average of 50 minutes a day more. Do you agree, Susan, that skills are becoming more important than credentials? So you did address this in the report, didn't you? It was very interesting.
Yes, this is where in the future I hope technology can help us even more. Employers used an educational credential mainly as a signaling device. So it's assumed that if you have a particular educational degree, that must mean that you have the skills and that you're going to be a good employee. But we all know that that is not at all the case. It's a very crude measure. And so sometimes now there are many new startups who have we call gamified programs. So you play a game online and it sort of demonstrates your innate skills in analyzing information or working with others or making decisions or showing empathy. And the hope would be that in the future, companies get smarter about focusing on what skills are required. And when they do that, what they find is that they get a much broader and more diverse pool of applicants for a position. And when they're clear about what skills they're hiring for rather than an educational degree, they can find more unusual and diverse sources of talent, but that work out just as well. But of course, it requires work on the hiring managers to really think carefully about what are the skills that I need rather than I want someone with a college degree or this other type of formal credential.
And this is a related one. Do companies need to provide reskilling and be open to employees from other industries, or are we as employees responsible for our own retraining?
So I think that it is a combination of companies, of governments or nonprofit organizations, as well as individuals taking charge. So starting with the individual, I think that we all need to get used to the idea that we're either going to change jobs, or if we don't, like I've been an economist now for 25 years, my job has actually radically changed over those 25 years in the tools that I use and what I do in my job. I think companies have a role and they're actively realizing that it's more effective and it's cheaper to retrain someone within the organization that knows the culture, knows the organization, to do a different job than just hiring in. But there will be industries like all those occupations I showed you where over time demand will go down. So there are people currently in retail sales or food service that may need to leave those jobs and switch occupations. And in that case, this is where the educational system or government support comes in, because they would be moving outside of their current employer to an entirely different field and career. And so I think of it as a three-legged stool where companies, public sector institutions, and individuals all have a role to play.
And just a question of mine following up from that, that the rise in these healthcare or people-facing jobs in the healthcare sector, it seems to be enormous. I mean, we don't really have the infrastructure for that at the moment. Are there any moves afoot to start upskilling vast numbers of people for that, or is there any pilot projects you know about?
Well, you're right that there has been a critical nursing shortage, and a lot of the growth in healthcare jobs is because simply of aging. And as people get older, they need more healthcare. So we have found, though, that there are programs. There's a nonprofit organization called Generation that works around the world that in some countries are training certified nurse assistant, which in the United States is the lowest rung on the nursing ladder. But it's a 12-week program. So you impart just the critical skills needed, and then the rest they can learn on the job. And that's been successful. So finding these short-term programs that are a matter of months or even weeks, not years of education, is going to be critical to helping people shift into where there is demand.
Thank you. And here's one. What do you see as the long-term future for the gig economy? That's a hot topic.
That is an interesting question. When we started this work last June, I was wondering if this was going to be the death of, not the death of the gig economy, but if this was going to be a real turning point. And there are several indications that that's not the case. If anything, it seems like freelancers and contractors might increase in usage. So we did a survey of business executives, and 70% of them said they were going to use more freelance or contract labor when they went back to the next normal. And within the gig economy, which I define as meaning you're working through a digital platform, so for instance, delivery, there's been a big shift. So obviously, rideshare has been way down, but delivery jobs and all those e-commerce last mile delivery are often done, all the restaurant delivery, food delivery are often done by independent contractors in the gig economy. So this whole shift to the digital platform e-commerce type world is actually creating more gig jobs. They're just different than they were before the pandemic.
Susan, I could keep talking about this for hours. It's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us. I'm sure there's much more to come in future, many more conversations to be had. Thank you to Susan from the Lund of the McKinsey Global Institute for that. And our next session will be very relevant, a panel moderated by my colleague Polita Clark on the topic of flexible work. So do stick around for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.